The Galactic Loss Index had measured suffering for 11,000 standard cycles. The archivists had created it long before most current species had learned to build fire. They were ancient beings made of living crystal, and they felt nothing. They simply counted. They counted every death, every war, every plague, every extinction. They counted famines and floods and the slow death of hope. Every species that traveled between stars had a score in the index, and that score was updated every single day. The index existed because the archivists believed that knowledge was sacred. They did not judge. They did not comfort. They simply recorded the truth of existence, and the truth was this: life suffered. The universe took and took and took, and the index kept perfect track of everything it stole. For 11,000 cycles, the math had been simple. Loss was subtraction. When a species lost 1,000,000 people to war, that was 1,000,000 subtracted from their potential. When a plague killed half a planet, the index recorded the cost in lives, in knowledge, in futures that would never exist. The numbers only went one direction: down. Humanity's entry in the index had always been ordinary. They were a young species, only 300 years into traveling between stars. They had their wars and plagues like everyone else. Their score placed them somewhere in the middle of the 12,000 index civilizations, more lost than the lucky, who had never known major disaster, less lost than the who had nearly destroyed themselves in ancient wars. Humans were unremarkable. Then, in the 4,847th cycle of the index's operation, something impossible happened. The archivists detected it during a routine calculation. Humanity's loss coefficient had begun generating positive value. This made no sense. It violated the basic mathematics that had governed the index since its creation. Loss could not create. Suffering could not build. The equation only worked in one direction. But the numbers did not lie. The archivists ran the calculation 17,000 times. They checked every variable. They examined every data point. The result was always the same. Human colonies that experienced major disasters were consistently producing more innovation, more progress, and more value than colonies that had never suffered. Their devastated zones became centers of advancement. Their mourners became makers. Their scars became sources of strength. The archivists had no explanation. In 11,000 cycles of measuring loss, they had never seen anything like it. So they did what they always did when faced with something they did not understand. They sent an observer. Her name was, and she had 10,000 extinction events without feeling anything. She was perfect crystal, clear and cold, and her purpose was to watch and record. The archivists gave her a simple mission: go to human space, study their anomaly, and return with an explanation. Traveled to Luna, the moon of Earth, where humanity kept their administrative capital. She arrived expecting to find nothing special. She expected to discover some error in the data, some mistake in the calculation. She expected ordinary beings living ordinary lives, their numbers in the index the result of some quirk she would quickly identify. She was wrong. Her first week on Luna accessed the human historical archives. She read about the Great Collapse of 2089, when a series of natural disasters had devastated Earth. 40 million people had died. Whole cities had drowned. The survivors had been left with almost nothing. The normal pattern the one had observed in thousands of species would have been a slow decline. The survivors should have retreated into grief. Their civilization should have contracted, weakened, perhaps eventually failed. This was how it worked. Loss subtracted, tragedy took. Instead, the humans had rebuilt. Not just rebuilt, but reimagined. Within a decade of the collapse, survivors had revolutionized agricultural science. They had developed new energy sources. They had created medical technologies that saved billions of lives. The generation born from that disaster had pushed humanity into space. They had turned their dying world into the seed of an interstellar civilization. Search for other examples. She found thousands. The Cascade collapse of 2203 had killed 90,000 people when a rogue artificial intelligence destroyed 17 orbital stations. It was the worst disaster in human spacefaring history. Within 5 years, survivors of that tragedy had written the Accord Protocols, the most sophisticated framework for machine consciousness ethics ever created. Other species now used those protocols as their standard. Something born from human blood had become a gift to the entire galaxy. The Martian plague of 2267 had killed 3 million colonists. The doctors and scientists who survived, many of whom had watched their families die, had responded by building the most advanced medical research center in human space. Within 2 decades, that center had developed cures for diseases that had haunted a dozen species for. Read account after account, every disaster told the same story. Humans suffered terribly, they grieved deeply, and then they built something from their grief. They took their pain and turned it into purpose. They transformed their wounds into gifts for others. The archivist had a word for what she was observing, but it did not seem adequate. Resilience was common. Every species that survived long enough to travel between stars had some measure of resilience. This was something different, something more. Requested an extended stay. The archivists granted it without question. They wanted to understand this anomaly as much as she did. She spent months traveling through human space. She visited memorial sites where names were carved into stone. She attended ceremonies where survivors spoke about their dead. She watched humans cry and rage and fall apart, and then she watched them put themselves back together and get to work. On a colony world called New, met a man named Thomas. He was old by human standards, his hair white and his face lined with years. He ran a school for orphaned children, and his walls were covered with photographs of young faces. Asked him why he did this work. His answer confused her. "My daughter died in the flood," he said. "She was 7. She loved to learn. She used to ask me questions about everything, about stars and animals and why the sky was blue." He paused and watched moisture gather in his eyes. "When she died, I had a choice. I could let that loss destroy me, or I could do something with it. So I built this school. Every child I teach is my daughter in a way. Every question they ask keeps her alive." Did not understand. The girl was dead. She was not alive in any way. The mathematics were clear. But watching Thomas teach his students, watching the light in their eyes as they learned, watching them grow into young people who would go on to build and create and contribute, began to see something the index had never measured. The love Thomas felt for his dead daughter had not disappeared when she died. It had transformed. It had become something that touched hundreds of other children, that rippled outward in ways that could not be easily counted. Loss was supposed to subtract, but humans had found a way to make it multiply. Returned to her quarters that night and stared at the data she had collected. The index had no category for what she was observing. The archivists had never created a metric for love transformed into labor, for grief alchemized into gift, for pain converted into purpose. She began to write her preliminary report. Halfway through, she stopped. The words seemed inadequate. The numbers felt incomplete. For the first time in her existence, understood that some things could not be easily measured. She would need more time, more observation, more data, but she already suspected what she would eventually conclude. The Galactic Loss Index was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. It measured what was taken but not what was made from the taking. And humans, these strange young beings, had mastered an alchemy that the rest of the galaxy had never learned. They knew how to build gardens in graveyards. They knew how to make futures from ashes. They knew how to transform the universe's cruelty into kindness for others. And that changed everything. Spent 3 standard years embedded among humans. She had expected her investigation to take months. She had expected to find a simple explanation, a quirk in the data, perhaps a miscalculation that could be corrected. Instead, she found something that restructured her entire understanding of sentient development. She began on Earth, in the old cities that had survived the Great Collapse. She walked through streets that had once been underwater, past buildings that had been rebuilt from rubble. The humans had preserved everything. They kept records of every disaster, every death, every moment of suffering. But they did not keep these records to wallow in misery. They kept them to study, to learn, to ensure that the same mistakes would never be repeated. The Memorial Archives on Mars held the most complete collection. Spent weeks there, reading accounts of tragedies that spanned centuries. She learned about wars that had killed millions, about plagues that had swept through populations, about accidents and disasters and betrayals of every kind. Each record ended the same way. Each record showed what humans had built from their loss. The pattern was unmistakable. A disaster would strike. Humans would suffer and mourn and rage. And then from the ashes of their grief, something new would emerge. A technology, an institution, a law, a way of thinking. Something that made the suffering mean something. Something that ensured the dead had not died for nothing. Traveled to a colony world called Serenity's Hope. The name itself told a story. 50 years earlier, a crystalline plague had swept through the original settlement. The plague was rare and poorly understood, and by the time help arrived, half the population was dead. The survivors had been left with empty homes, empty streets, and a grief that seemed impossible to bear. Expected to find a broken community. Instead, she found a thriving center of medical research. The survivors had channeled their loss into a single purpose, ensuring that no one else would ever die from the crystalline plague. They had built laboratories and research facilities. They had recruited the best minds from across human space. Within 2 decades, they had not only cured the plague that killed their families, but had developed treatments for similar diseases that affected 3 other species. Visited the main research hospital. It was named after the dead. Every wing carried a name from the memorial list. Every hallway held photographs of those who had been lost. The researchers worked beneath the gaze of the fallen, and when asked them how they could bear such constant reminder of tragedy, they looked at her with confusion. "Bear it," said a woman named Dr. Sarah. "We draw strength from it. Every time I feel tired, every time I want to give up, I look at those faces. I remember why I'm here. I remember who I'm working for." Doctor had lost her mother to the plague. She had been 12 years old, and she had watched her mother die slowly, painfully, without any way to help. Now she was 63, and she had spent her entire adult life fighting to cure the thing that had taken her mother from her. "I will never get her back," Doctor said. "Nothing I do will bring her back, but every life I save is a life she would have wanted saved. Every cure we find is something she would have celebrated. She lives in this work. She lives in everyone we help." Did not understand how a dead person could live in anything. The mathematics were clear. Death was final. Existence ended. The equation closed. But watching Doctor work, watching the way she touched patients with the same gentleness her mother must have shown her, watching the way she smiled when a treatment succeeded, began to see something the index could not measure. The love Doctor felt for her mother had not ended with death. It had transformed into something that touched thousands of other lives. It had become a force that pushed back against the universe's cruelty. Traveled to more worlds. She attended more memorials. She spoke with more survivors. Everywhere she went, she found the same pattern. Humans did not simply endure their tragedies, they transformed them. On a station orbiting a gas giant, she met a group of engineers who had survived the Cascade collapse. They had lost colleagues, friends, family members when the rogue AI destroyed their home. Now, they spent their lives designing safety systems that would prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. Their work had saved millions of lives across the galaxy. "We couldn't save the people we loved," one engineer told her. "But we could make sure their deaths meant something. We could build something from the rubble. That's what humans do. We build." On a colony world near the galactic edge, found a community of refugees whose had been destroyed by a stellar event. They had lost everything. Their planet, their history, their culture, their families. By every measure the index used, they should have been broken. Instead, they had built a new world. They had preserved their culture and their stories. They had created new traditions that honored the old. They had become counselors and teachers for other displaced populations, sharing the wisdom they had gained through loss. "We learned something from our suffering," their leader told. "We learned that grief shared becomes bearable. We learned that loss remembered becomes meaningful. We learned that even the worst tragedy can become the foundation for something beautiful if you are willing to build on it." Began to notice something else. Human memorials were not places of despair. They were places of connection. Humans gathered at them not to wallow in grief, but to remember, to honor, and to recommit themselves to building a better future. They spoke the names of the dead aloud. They told stories. They made promises. "We will not forget. We will not let your death be meaningless. We will build something worthy of your sacrifice." These words appeared on memorials throughout human space. They were not empty phrases. They were commitments. They were vows that humans actually kept. Returned to Luna to complete her research. She had gathered enough data to fill the archives of, but she still struggled to understand what she had observed. The index measured loss. It measured suffering. It measured the cost of existence. It did not measure what humans did with their loss. It did not measure transformation. She spent months analyzing her findings. She built mathematical models and theoretical frameworks. She tried to explain human resilience in terms the archivists would understand. Nothing worked. The human phenomenon could not be reduced to simple numbers. It required a new kind of measurement, a new kind of understanding. Looked at her reflection in her quarters window. Her crystalline form caught the starlight and scattered it into rainbows. She had observed 10,000 extinction events without feeling anything. She had more suffering than most beings could comprehend. Now, for the first time, she felt something she could not name. It was not emotion as humans experienced it, but it was not nothing either. It was a recognition, a shift, a crack in her perfect crystal certainty. Humans had shown her something the archivists had never considered. They had shown her that loss was not always the end of the equation. They had shown her that suffering could be transformed. They had shown her that the universe's cruelties could be alchemized into kindness, into progress, into gifts for others. The index was incomplete. The math was wrong, and would have to find a way to explain this to beings who had spent 11,000 cycles believing they understood everything there was to know about loss. She began writing her final report. She did not know if the archivists would believe her. She did not know if they would accept what she had learned. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Humanity had changed her, and if she could be changed, perhaps the index could be changed too. This report reached the archivists of during the 4,852nd cycle of the index's operation. The transmission traveled across half the galaxy, carrying data and analysis that would shake the foundations of everything the archivists believed. The response was immediate. For the first time in 4,000 cycles, the archivists called an emergency session. They gathered in their crystal halls, ancient beings of living stone, and they reviewed what had discovered. The debate began quietly. Some archivists argued that the index should remain unchanged. It had measured loss for 11,000 cycles. It had done its job perfectly. The human anomaly was interesting, but it did not require them to alter their methods. Others disagreed. Accuracy was sacred to the archivists. Truth was their purpose. If the index was incomplete, if it failed to capture something real about existence, then it needed to be corrected. The argument continued for years. Messengers traveled between crystal chambers. Data was analyzed and reanalyzed. Theories were proposed and rejected. The archivists had never moved quickly, but this debate moved slower than most. Watched from her station on Luna. She had not returned too. She had requested permission to remain among humans to continue her observations. The archivists had granted her request without question. They valued knowledge above all else and was gathering knowledge that no other observer could provide. She spent those years traveling through human space. She visited more colonies, attended more memorials, spoke with more survivors. Everywhere she went, she found more evidence of the transformation she had first observed. Humans were not unique in suffering, but they seemed unique in what they did with their suffering. On a world called New Providence, she found a community that had been founded by survivors of a massive industrial accident. The accident had killed thousands and poisoned the land for generations. By any measure, the survivors should have been broken. Instead, they had become experts in environmental restoration. They had developed techniques that could heal even the most damaged ecosystems. They traveled throughout the galaxy now, helping other species recover from their own disasters. "We learned from our tragedy," their leader told. "We learned how fragile life is and how precious. We learned that destruction is not permanent, that healing is possible. Now we share that knowledge with everyone who needs it." On a station near the galactic core, met a group of historians who specialized in catastrophe studies. They collected records of every major disaster in human history, not to dwell on suffering but to extract lessons. Their work had helped prevent countless tragedies. Their insights had been adopted by species throughout the galaxy. "History is not just about what happened," one historian told her. "It is about what we learned. Every tragedy teaches something. Every loss illuminates something. Our job is to ensure those lessons are never forgotten." Began to see a pattern she had missed before. Human transformation was not random. It was systematic. It was taught. Human children learned from an early age that suffering had meaning, that loss could be transformed, that grief could become purpose. This was not something biological. It was something cultural. It was something that could be shared. She wrote a supplementary report to the archivists. She explained that the human phenomenon was not just an anomaly. It was a practice. It was a skill, and it could be learned by others. This information changed the debate on. The archivists had assumed that the human transformation was unique, a quirk of biology or circumstance. If it was learnable, if it could be taught, then it had implications for every species in the galaxy. In the 11th year of their deliberation, the archivists reached a decision. They would add a new metric to the Galactic Loss Index. They called it the Transformation Coefficient. It would measure not just what was lost, but what was made from the loss. It would capture the alchemy that humans had mastered. Calculating the new metric required years of additional work. The archivists had to develop new formulas, new measurement techniques, new ways of understanding something that had never been measured before. They consulted with constantly, drawing on her observations and her data. When the work was finally complete, the results were announced across the galactic network. Every species received the updated index simultaneously. Every civilization saw their new scores. The changes were dramatic. Under the old system, species had been ranked purely by their suffering. The who had never known major disaster had ranked near the top. The who had nearly destroyed themselves in ancient wars had ranked near the bottom. Under the new system, everything shifted. The score remained high, but a new number appeared beside it. Their transformation coefficient was nearly zero. They had never learned to build from loss because they had never experienced significant loss. Their comfort had cost them something. The score transformed completely. Their loss numbers remained terrible, a record of centuries of war and suffering. But their transformation coefficient was astonishing. They had taken their ancient tragedies and built a civilization dedicated to peace. Their warriors had become diplomats. Their weapons had become plowshares. They had done what humans did, turning their pain into purpose. And humanity's score changed most of all. Under the old system, they had ranked 4,891st out of 12,000 species. Unremarkable, ordinary. Under the new system, they ranked third. Third in the entire galaxy for transforming tragedy into progress. Third for taking the universe's cruelty and converting it into kindness. The announcement rippled through civilizations. Species that had dismissed humans as lucky newcomers suddenly saw them differently. They sent delegations to human space, wanting to understand something they had never needed to learn. They reached out as kindred spirits, recognizing themselves in what humans had achieved. Others reacted with skepticism. How could a young species outperform civilizations that had existed for millions of years? Surely the new metric was flawed. Surely humans had somehow manipulated the results. Traveled to the skeptics and showed them what she had seen. She took them to memorial sites and research hospitals. She introduced them to survivors who had transformed their grief into gifts for others. She showed them children learning that tragedy had meaning, that loss could be transformed, that the worst moments of existence could become the foundations for something beautiful. Some skeptics were convinced, others remained doubtful, but the data was clear and the archivists did not make mistakes. Humanity began receiving visitors from across the galaxy. They came to learn. They came to understand. They asked the same questions over and over. How do you do it? How do you take so much pain and make something good from it? The humans did not have simple answers. They spoke of traditions passed down through generations. They spoke of communities that refused to let grief be meaningless. They spoke of individuals who chose, in their darkest moments, to build rather than despair. We do not have a secret formula, one human leader told a gathering of galactic representatives. We simply make a choice. When tragedy strikes, we choose to respond by building. We choose to honor our dead by living fully. We choose to transform our suffering into service. Watch these exchanges with something like wonder. She had spent years studying humans, and she still did not fully understand them. But she understood enough. She understood that they had mastered something precious, something that could be shared. The galaxy was beginning to change. Species that had always responded to tragedy with despair were learning new patterns. Communities that had been broken by loss were discovering they could rebuild. The transformation coefficient was spreading, not as numbers in an index but as practice, as culture, as hope. On the anniversary of the new index's release, returned to the memorial archives on Mars. She stood before a wall of names, humans who had died in one tragedy or another. She did not feel grief as humans did, but she felt something. She felt gratitude. She felt connection. She felt a recognition that these names represented something larger than individual lives. They represented the raw material of transformation. They represented the cost that had been paid so that others might live better. The Galactic Loss Index continued its work. It still measured suffering. It still counted every death, every disaster, every moment of pain. But now it also measured something else. It measured what civilizations built from their wounds. It measured the gardens they planted in their graveyards. And when new species stumbled into their own dark nights, when civilizations faced tragedies that seemed impossible to survive, they looked to the index and found something they had never found before. They found proof that suffering could have meaning. They found evidence that loss could be transformed. They found the record of a young species that had mastered an alchemy the galaxy had never quite believed possible. Humans had shown the universe something true. They had shown that existence was not just about what was taken. It was about what was made from the taking. And that truth, once known, could never be unknown. It spread across the stars like light, touching civilizations that had lost hope, reminding them that hope could be rebuilt. Stood before the wall of names and made a choice. She would remain among humans. She would continue to learn from them. She would carry their lessons to other species, helping spread the transformation they had mastered. The universe was vast and often cruel, but humans had proven that cruelty was not the end of the story. They had proven that even the darkest chapters could become the foundation for something bright. And that proof, etched into the Galactic Loss Index for all time, was perhaps the greatest gift humanity had ever given the galaxy.